Good evening, everyone. We're here tonight for David Gordon's author event. We are promptly starting right at 6, but we're just going to kill just a minute or so of time, just making sure that you all can actually log in. For instance, I already see we have a comment, but at the same time, I don't see the viewer count. So sometimes there's a little disparity, or if you're across the room washing dishes, now is the moment to direct your attention to the screen. And we'll be getting started momentarily. Oh, there it goes. All right, so we already have a crowd. So we don't want to keep those of you who are already tuned in waiting. Obviously you all get to watch it live, but then this will be on our YouTube and Facebook after the fact. So you'll get an opportunity if for some reason you miss anything or just want to share it with friends and watch it again. So tonight, it's my real pleasure to welcome David Gordon to celebrate the launch of Against the Law. My name is Tom Wickersham from the Mysterious Bookshop, and I'll be interviewing David tonight. You may know David from his previous 2 Joe the Bouncer novels. Just first of all, he was introduced in The Bouncer, and then its sequel, The Hard Stuff. He is also the author of the novel The Serialist, which won the VCU Kabul First Novel Award and was turned into a film in Japan. And he has worked extensively in various fields, including teaching writing, publishing, fashion, and pornography, which perhaps provided some of the inspiration for Joe, the strip club bouncer. And so we're pleased to welcome David Gordon. And so, David, for starters, if anyone hasn't read the Bouncer novels before, this is the 3rd one, and I will say that it starts with an action-packed bang as well as a very breezy reintroduction to the characters we've known, catching you up to where they are. But just how would you introduce Joe in the series if someone were to start with book 3, or just a little bit about how he came to be?
Great. Okay, well, you actually provided the perfect segue because the very first seed of the character came when I was profiling strippers in San Francisco who were embroiled in a labor dispute. And one of them was telling me how she figured out that this club she used to work at was run by the mob. And she said it was because there was a big brawl outside. And when she ran and told the manager to call the cops, he picked up and dialed the phone. And she thought the police would come. And instead, she said, quote, a Cadillac pulled up and this fat guy with a gun jumped out and chased everybody away. And she said, and I realized that was our police. And so I had this sort of idea of, who do you call if you live in a world where you can just never call the cops? And then many years later, that idea grew, and I sort of thought, what if a bunch of gangsters realized that there might be a suspected terrorist among them? And I kind of had really the only super high concept elevator pitch I've ever had. It was 3 words: Mafia versus ISIS. And so I sort of put those ideas together, and I came up with Joe, who, when we meet him in The Bouncer, is this somewhat mysterious guy because he seems like a sort of likable, charming, but somewhat simple loser, basically, who works as a bouncer at a strip club, lives with his grandma in Queens, reads a lot, watches Jeopardy, but then ends up getting recruited by these crime bosses who need help trying to stop a terrorist attack. So that's Joe.
One of the things that's interesting about the book is it's not, however effective he may have actually been, it's not sort of the idea of Lucky Luciano aiding the government by doing criminality. There's almost a formation of a sort of secret government between all of these various crime factions. And it's both, I don't mean to paint the books as being purely humorous, but there's a lot of humor in that. And I wondered how much research you went into, if you wanted to sort of describe almost that council. It's almost a whole sort of secret world where there is law enforcement, but as you said, it's 911 for people who can't call the cops.
Yeah, exactly. And definitely those stories about World War II were one of the main inspirations, right? Where supposedly the government did reach out to Lucky Luciano, who was the head of the mafia, and to various other people under him for a couple of different things, right? To help secure the waterfront. So the mafia at the time was running the waterfront in Brooklyn, particularly, and they were asked to keep an eye out for sabotage, for smuggling, for things like that. And then supposedly the mafia helped with the invasion, the Allied invasion of Italy, by letting them know what beaches were safe and so forth. So that was definitely one of the beginnings, as well as just a lot of kind of like a kind of folk level sense of New York as this kind of world made of all these different little sort of duchies almost, right? Where you sort of, you cross from one neighborhood into another, and there's a different culture and a different language. And then, of course, many of these various groups, whether it's by ethnic group or geographical area, also have their own sort of crime world, and as we see in these books, that's even true, let's say, in the heavily religious Hasidic parts of Brooklyn or whatever, where they have their own criminals, and then there's their own gangs that are in prison, and then they also have their own sort of deputized security patrols that go around. And so it really kind of grew out of that, although once it sort of took on a life of its own and I started writing these characters, obviously it became also somewhat of almost my own kind of, I don't know, like my own version of a kind of Marvel comic world or whatever. There are these like underground councils happening, these meetings in matzah warehouses or the tops of construction sites and so forth. Which is another, I think, big part of New York, is just the sense that there is some kind of mysterious underground world happening, even if you don't know about it, and a lot of it's probably not true.
I think, if I remember correctly, I remember an interview with James Elroy where he once said that John Gregory Dunn's True Confessions is all nonsense. It's about an LA that never existed but should have.
Right.
Which I always like. The idea that it's, maybe this isn't the real world, but there's something real about it that's sort of very vital and energized. Yeah.
Which Elroy is a really great example, because I think, his LA, I mean, that's how I feel about New York, right? Like I feel like I'm from here, but I also grew up with the mythic New York that we all did in my head. So there's that doubleness where, I mean, I forget why it came up, but I was thinking about that great 70s film, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, right? Which is like a classic crime movie, which I saw at a double feature with my grandfather. And I don't remember exactly, but the odds are very good that we took the subway home afterward, right? Mm-hmm. So that idea where it's like, did anything like The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3 ever happen? No. Mm-hmm. But it was being shot in a world that was my very mundane everyday world. And so that's part of what I keep trying to capture in these books is a New York that's both more real in being more outer borough, more working class, more multi-ethnic than what you normally see on TV or whatever, but also kind of mythic, kind of dreamlike,
Yeah. I mean, I am curious how much on-the-ground research you did do, or if you know any people, not necessarily, I mean, perhaps you do and you'll tell us, not necessarily context of a criminal nature, but sort of in these insular communities. I've had a meal in Brighton Beach where, as far as I can tell, I was the only person in the restaurant not speaking Russian, including the waiters, where I had to point and hope I was getting. So, I mean, some of these places, they really aren't, they might be superficially welcoming, but they're sort of hard to penetrate, to feel like an insider or maybe gain the confidence to write about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's what you really think of as research. I mean, I do a lot of research in terms of, I look at a lot of maps to make sure I'm getting the one-way streets right. I spend a lot of time looking like various kinds of specs to sort of try and make sure that this thing I'm imagining is at least physically possible, whether it's like an elevator or this or that. But I also, in this book, I spent days and days just looking at pictures of Afghanistan and places like that. And I do have people, I ended up thanking, I think, 4 or 5 people in the acknowledgments of this book just to help me out with languages and stuff, like things like that. I go to people who are more expert than me. And even then, you get caught out. But a lot of it is really just, there's that great Henry James line where he was asked to, I think he was actually giving a speech, but his only real advice to aspiring young writers was, he said, try to be one of those people on whom nothing is lost. And so I think that a lot of the kind of stuff you're talking about really comes from just being fascinated with like traveling around the city, meeting people, listening to people, talking to people, hearing their stories, overhearing what they say, and just picking up these like tiny little fragments, like that random anecdote that I was told all those years ago that became Joe. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, I hung out in Brighton Beach a lot. I walked around, I talked to people, I saw the Russian guys covered in tattoos sitting around, sunning themselves on the pier on, Coney Island. I had people explain to me what the tattoos meant and, who to stay away from and all that kind of stuff. And did witness some sort of scenes. I remember being in it was I can't remember now if it was maybe Ukrainian, but a restaurant in the East Village. And these people came in and it was a guy in a really fancy suit with a lot of jewelry and a woman with him. And they kept ordering one thing after another and tasting it and sending it back and were really rude. And finally they walked out. They were like, this food isn't good enough. And after they left, that people were like, those were gangsters from Brighton Beach who had driven in and, and so things like that, you just, you see a lot and you hear a lot and you kind of and then 10 years later, I'm writing a scene and that pops up or something comes up.
Now, one place, oh, sorry, no.
I was just thinking the Banyas, there's a big scene in this book that takes place in a Russian bathhouse. And I'm just a fan of those places. For years and years, I've been going to different Russian bathhouses all around the city. And then, in my mind, I sort of designed this ideal one where this extremely bloody scene takes place. So that's sort of my research,
Yeah. One place I'm sure you haven't been, and also it was a bit of a departure from, or I wouldn't say departure, but it's going further afield, is as you mentioned. So I don't know if you said this in your introduction, but Joe is a veteran. He's haunted by his war experiences, and this book opens with him returning to Afghanistan. And while it's been a very international in its cast of characters series, here we actually almost have, or we do have, sort of international thriller elements involving, essentially hired guns in Afghanistan, his memories of wars, international drug smuggling as it's tied into war. There I imagine you did not go to Afghanistan, but those are some very good scenes.
Yeah, I went via the magic of the internet and I read a lot about it. And, it's always a big challenge to try to write about a place that you don't know intimately. What I tried to do was really just do way more reading and research than probably was necessary, right? I mean, it's really just a sequence of scenes that taking place in certain locations there. But I was looking at photographs of there's an action sequence that takes place in this one square. And I was looking at blown up photographs of the exact place and sort of looking at the buildings. So I try to get as close as I could. And I was lucky enough to have a friend, maybe she's even here, I don't know, who checked all of my, language. But remember, even though I am setting it in this place, the characters are strangers there as well. So that was the other thing. Like, I didn't feel like I had to have like a native's knowledge because it wasn't from the point of view of natives. But yeah, I thought it would just be a really exciting way to open the book because it is so different, right? Like, we've been with Joe. I think the furthest he goes is they go to New Jersey, maybe, right? And then suddenly he's prone with a sniper rifle in a poppy field, waiting for somebody to come along, and hopefully he's going to shoot them. And that's the opening scene of the book. And so I just thought it was like a great way to change things up and to sort of, and as you said, I also tried to sort of, I mean, from the start, I feel like, although I definitely think of these as sort of classic heist caper books, there was also a kind of espionage element, just because he's dealing with terrorists. Yeah. And in this book, I tried to really kind of boost that side of it. And so there is much more of, as you say, mercenaries and international smugglers and terrorists and CIA operatives and rogue CIA contractors and people like that. So yeah, that was definitely one of the ways when I was thinking about trying to open the world up a bit more, and also just keep mixing these genres in the ways that excite me.
I mean, and when I also think it ties into what was your original premise of sort of the policing the underworld, or this sort of government, this governing body in the ungovernable, and depending on how much of various stories you want to believe, long-standing ties of organized crime and the CIA, and funding operations through heroin, and well before modern the modern conflict in Afghanistan.
Yeah, so that was definitely one of the big elements, was that history of the CIA, for example, being involved in heroin trafficking during the Vietnam War, for example. And, something I do remember once seeing was bricks of hashish. This was way, way back in the 80s, stamped with a gold emblem that had 2 Kalashnikov rifles, and it said, "Support Afghani freedom fighter." Mm-hmm. And that was, so somehow that money was going back to the people who were then fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, who, as we know, later became known as the Taliban. So all these things are inextricably linked in reality. What I do is try and just absorb as much as I can of that history and reality, and then create my own kind of alternative fictional world. So to the best of my knowledge, nothing that happened in this book ever really happened, but yeah, there's definitely lots of it's not as wildly implausible as it may sound either.
No, I feel like all of those histories, of which I am a fan, I always try to find the ones that are most credibly sourced and everything. There's always a fair amount of what you have to take as conjecture, but it might be delivered a little more over the top and entertaining in your view, but yeah, I could see what a lot of the real world inspiration could be.
And I mean, I remember, it was very dark days, but it was also in its own way kind of comic. I mean, I remember after 9/11, just being around these kind of neighborhood characters, right? Like not serious wise guys, but just tough guys who'd lived their entire life on like Avenue B or whatever. And they were like, they're not getting away with this. When New York fights back, we're going to get them. And I just had this image of like a bunch of guys with like baseball bats, like climbing on a plane. And, and I remember thinking like, New York doesn't actually have its own army. Like we can't actually wage a war, but I pictured those guys, like, what I mean? What if they actually did have to sort of get together and try and like stop a terrorist event? So, yeah.
So, we've established there's certainly some darker themes and darker elements to Joe's character, but there's also a lot of humor in the book. And I really enjoyed I think all of the characters are introduced with this leitmotif, which the word just popped in my head. I don't know if I've ever said it out loud before. Is that how you say it? I don't know.
I think so, yeah.
It's one of those words that you see written down, but blank character was in hell.
Yeah.
And that can range from literally being in the desert with a sniper rifle to being in a car with someone who smokes and smells awful. But it's a very funny way and to introduce all the characters in the range in which they're introduced. But I wonder how calculated you were about the use of humor when you decided to write this. What if reduced to its bare bones could just on paper as plot points look like a very grim crime story, or how much that's just sort of your natural voice coming out that was unavoidable.
Yeah, I mean, it is my natural voice. I suppose it's unavoidable because I've certainly found myself laughing or making jokes that sometimes people weren't that thrilled to hear in situations. So I guess it's unavoidable. And it's also what I like in writing, and the way that, I mean, it's the kind of books I like. I don't, I'm trying to, George Bernard Shaw, I was spacing on the name. There's a great quote from him where he was accused of having jokes during what were supposed to be sad parts of his plays. And he said, life doesn't stop being funny when someone dies any more than it stops being sad when people are laughing, right? I'm paraphrasing. And I've always felt like that. I always felt like in many ways I have like a sort of comic view of the world. There's always something that just strikes me as funny, even in very dark times. So I think I tend to just write that way. I think almost everything I've written is somewhat humorous, but I also am a big fan of this kind of book, of like heist and caper books. And part of what I love about them is that there always is a kind of high-spiritedness to them.
Mm-hmm.
Some really are just straight up comic novels or films or whatever, but even the ones where the stakes are very high and it's potentially very dangerous and dark, there's just something kind of like lighthearted about these ideas of like people pulling off these schemes and capers and so forth. And so to me, it's fun. It's fun to read and write about that kind of stuff. So
I'm curious, who were some of your influences specifically on the crime front, but then also just other writers who may unexpectedly have influenced these kind of books?
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a very broad, but to start with the specifics, I'll get really specific and not even just say on the crime front. I'll just talk about these because even that, there's so many. There's people like, Jim Thompson and Raymond Chandler and on who I love, but who I don't know how much direct influence on these they've had. But certainly Donald Westlake, who is the sort of king of the caper novel. And for these books in particular, the ones he wrote as Richard Stark, the Parker books, which are just masterpieces of this kind of plotting. I almost feel like when I open one of those, I just have to finish it. And so really, in terms of structuring like a heist, that was my model. I really was like, can I do this? Also, I was thinking about Chester Himes a lot when I was writing these books, who wrote a series of crime novels set in Harlem. They actually follow the lives of detectives, but there's all kinds of crazy heists and a lot of wild humor and crazy action and a real kind of granular, loving description of life, food and clothes. And sometimes he goes right down the block and tells you every single storefront. And the amazing thing about those books is, to me, they just seemed almost surreal. And then I would assign them to reading groups, and older group members who grew up in Harlem would say, no, this is exactly what it was like. And I would say, what do you mean? How could there be this? He has like a Kentucky Fried Colonel in a white suit fighting with black nationalists and police firing bullets down the street to keep them
A white man with a pistol.
Yeah, and they would just say, no, that's exactly what it was like. So that idea, that something, that kind of energy. And then Elmore Leonard, who is just one of my favorite writers and always an influence. I mean, he influenced me so much that as a teenager, I kept naming my main characters Elmore, Elvin, finally Leonard, and I think a lot of the idea of a kind of wry humor that comes through the characters and the dialogue, even when, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of really dark, kind of depressing stuff happens in his books, and yet he's just hilarious. So
yeah,
those are the ones for this.
Tragic.
In terms of influences, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I'm really one of those people who, I mean, I led the Proust Society's discussion group for several years. So even though I'm a big kind of genre nerd, I'm also, like that kind of guy. Like I taught Ulysses. I led this Proust discussion group. So I really do love all of that sort of classic literature. But, just recently, I actually was given the opportunity by Crime Reads to give a list of books I loved set in the sort of New York underworld. And some of them were like, the Nero Wolfe books or Lawrence Bloch's books. But some of them were, William Burroughs, Hubert Selby, Mary Gateskill, people like that were sort of writing these kind of very tough, very kind of real New York books, but who were also stylists, who were sort of maybe even like avant-garde writers. So a lot of that is sort of in the background as well.
I think, well, actually, before I forget, I have no doubt that he had the firsthand experience, but I think Chester Himes may have written all of the Harlem, or at least most of the Harlem Detective novels while living in Paris.
Yes.
And admitted that a lot of it was his imagination, or, is his recollection. He certainly didn't have the internet, but that he wasn't walking down the block, but for him to remember and capture the spirit of it so well that,
it's incredible. I feel like it's like, I think Harlem to him is like Dublin to Joyce. Mm-hmm. Right? Like basically Joyce never wanted to go back there, right? It was the last thing he wanted to do. He lived in Europe his whole life, but everything he wrote was obsessively detailed, perfect settings in Dublin. And I think that for Chester Himes, it's the same thing. It's like the place he lived in France. He did not want to come back here for a lot of obvious reasons, but he also clearly couldn't stop thinking about Harlem. Yeah.
So I put it into the chat, but I'm just going to let everyone know if you want to start thinking of any questions, and feel free to type them. We'll be taking audience questions in just a moment. And someone else who I thought of, David, from the description you were giving, and I have to thank David for this introduction, is the writer Simon Raven, who is woefully underappreciated anywhere, certainly in the United States, who wrote a series of books where there's a few characters will always connect them, but there's no one main protagonist. But he also writes books that there are some very dark moments. There's one set in West Germany that's really like a basically just a spy novel, while most of them are almost kind of like, Evelyn Waugh-esque society. Like some of them are like sex farces. One is about homosexuality and like a school. But it's funny that that's someone who, again, I thank you for introducing me to, and really runs that gamut of just being an incredibly readable, entertaining writer, but where no sort of topic or tone, certainly no genre restrictions seem to confine him.
Yeah, that's one of the he's a fascinating writer, a fascinating guy. A real character. I mean, sort of like an old world libertine of the sort that I don't think we quite have anymore. But also, as you pointed out, one of the things, like you said, there's the mixing of comedy and a lot of dark material. But one of the other things that's amazing to me is, as you say, even though the characters come back, he's writing across totally different genres, which is amazing. Like some are like coming of age romance between boys at a school. Some are, as you say, like spy novels. Some are like satire, political satires. I mean,
the publishing world, the magazine one.
Yeah.
I read them all back to back, so the titles are escaping me, but that one's great. Yeah.
And of course, you know, his voice and his sense of humor is consistent, but really these are books that normally would not even be shelved in the same place. Yeah. And that to me is sort of amazing. Very difficult to pull off. I actually have, you know, a book of my own that I'm still trying to find a home for. One of the issues is that even though it's one novel, but it takes place over a long period of time, and the genre keeps changing. Mm-hmm. It sort of goes from being like comedy to crime to science fiction, and so he was very. I think I may have written that before I actually came across his books, but he impressed me a lot by his ability to pull that off. Yeah,
I think when you said. I don't know the exact word you said, but a libertine or kind of like maybe a scoundrel would be a good word. I think the famous quote of his is, I think one of his many ex-wives once wrote to him saying that she had no money to feed their young child. And he wrote back, "No money to send, suggest you eat baby."
Yeah.
Which makes him seem like he was a real bastard to know in real life, but he had a certain dark wit about him.
Yeah, but also weirdly, like, no, I mean, we're going back to what, he grows up during World War I, I think, right? Or between the wars?
Yeah, I think so. Too young to fight in World War II, assuming that the chronology is somewhat autobiographical, which I think
completely open and apparent, and with no issues or conflicts at all about his enthusiastic bisexuality, about his drinking and eating, about his gambling. He was actually he was kicked out of the armed forces for gambling debts that he didn't pay for, you know, ungentlemanly conduct. But then also ended up quite poor and living in like almost like a monastery, right? Like they gave him a little room as a sort of former scholar. Oh, and he was a classics scholar and a classics expert, and ended up just living in like a little, almost like a cell with a single bed, and was quite content that way too. Like just like a real, like I said, almost it seems like from another world.
Again, if anyone else has any questions, please chime in. I can keep it going, but maybe we'll do our first audience question. Hang on one moment. This will hopefully pop up. Can you talk about writing of the book, how long it took, stumbling blocks? So I guess more of the kind of logistical process of how you work as a writer.
Well, I guess, it's always sort of different and sort of the same for me. With these books, because the plot is so complicated, I don't want to start a crime novel and then realize I have no idea who the killer is or something. So I do write a fairly intense outline, but then I have a tendency to almost immediately disregard it and just shoot off track. I tend to try and write a first draft. I think of it as fast. I have no idea whether it actually is fast, because there are certainly days when I don't even write one sentence and I'm just sitting here stuck the whole day. But I mean fast in the sense that I try not to stop or look back. If I have any kind of momentum, I just keep going, because I feel like one of those cartoon characters that's run off the cliff. Like, I feel like if I even go back and reread page 1, I'm probably going to light the thing on fire and start over. So that's what I do. I try to keep going. Then I have a breakdown and I realize that, I've made a giant mess, and then I make another whole outline and, I don't want to mess up the camera by moving my laptop around, but I end up with a wall that looks like I'm hunting serial killers or something, covered with notes and so forth. And, I mean, I'm lucky. I don't know that I've ever really been, knock on wood, blocked in the classic sense. But I also feel like if what you mean is stuck, then I feel like that's just writing, right? Like every day I'm stuck. Like every day I sit down and I think, what am I going to do? How am I even going to like write this scene? And then I have like a sort of vague idea, well, maybe this could work, or I just get mad at myself and I say, just write a sentence, just start. And then it, and then it goes. And then somehow I end up with a manuscript. And my first read through of it is, I often say I actually don't mind rewriting at all, but I hate rereading, right? It's that moment when I read what I've done that I just want to quit. And I write comments that as a teacher, I would rightfully be fired immediately on my own manuscript. I just write, you stink, this sucks, whatever, God help me or whatever. And then I calm down and I go through and I fix it. And I do that again and again and again, many times. And then I show it to a friend or two, and then they tell me and I do it again. And then the editor do it again. And at a certain point, they take it out of my hands. And if I'm lucky, they print it.
Yeah. I mean, the classic, it sounds like enjoy having written.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, the actual writing, I do enjoy it. Like when I'm really like, I mean, right now I'm rewriting stuff, and it's right here. This is my desk, and that sense of focus and just being wrapped up in it and sort of working on it, that really is like a kind of pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
But when you step back and think, okay, now what? That's when it all comes in.
Oh. Actually, I didn't even mean to click on this. Well, not to make the whole thing about Simon Raven, but I will write his name in the chat. Simon Raven.
Yeah, like the bird.
Yes. And I would say that I think my favorite might be Sound the Retreat, which is about a bunch of English soldiers being sent to India in, I don't know what it is, 1947.
Yeah.
Essentially, when India has already been officially declared free. So they're being sent to join the Royal Indian Army, which no longer exists or is not going to exist in 3 months. But the journey to get there takes however many months. And it's almost like a catch-22.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're, whatever the name of that original series of books is, they're all great.
Yeah. Alms for Oblivion. That's what it's called.
Yes, that's what I don't know, what do you call it when it's a long series or it's like a
cycle, a novel cycle?
Yes. Sure.
Alms for Oblivion. I'm looking at them on the shelf.
Yeah. I'm curious, do you have now, do you feel that, I mean, I know that your previous work, you were nominated for an Edgar Award, and actually wanted to ask about your time in Japan, which you mentioned before we went live, but I know you have quite the following there, including that's been a film adaptation and what it's like to have that international fan base when we're talking about, communities where you might not, immediately share a language, or in this case, even, any familiarity of the city or, country. But are you now, planning to continue the Joe the Bouncer series? Are you enjoying writing these kinds of books and sort of feel like you found your groove with them?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love writing these books. And I guess 3 officially makes it a series. So that's what I was thinking. Like 2 could just be some kind of weird anomaly. Yes, someone just.
We got a question. Was that the next one?
Yeah, this is the next one that I'm sort of feverishly working on. Joe number 4, to be called The Wildlife. So yeah. I mean, I'm ready to keep writing them as long as people keep wanting to read them. But yeah. So, but the funny thing is, one of the many weird twists in my life is I wrote a book called The Serialist, but never thought I would actually write a series. And that book is about a sort of pulp writer who has multiple series going under different names.
Okay.
Vampire books, a sort of softcore porn series, science fiction, crime, and he gets involved with a serial killer. And so that was the sort of, and obviously a lot of that book grew out of my love of reading various series and being a fan of crime series. But I really wrote The Bouncer just thinking it would be a one-off. And it was actually Otto, who we both know and both work for, who kind of casually said, I'm thinking maybe you were even there after The Bouncer came out. Well, you know, maybe in the next one, or if you do another one. And I thought, what, another one? And sort of ran home and tried to come up with a story. So it really was not something that I ever imagined. But now that I'm doing it, it's really a lot of fun.
And then I am curious about Japan. You know,
Okay,
you can take that question in any direction you want. But
well,
it's fascinating, you know, when something in translation, especially when you yourself couldn't even read the translation, really takes off.
So that first novel, which, I mean, I was happy with how it did here for a first book. It won some awards. It got nominated for an Edgar, but it actually became a huge bestseller in Japan, not here. And it was just this, you know, it was just this random thing. Yet, like, as some of you who are in publishing know, they just go out and they try to sell the book in as many markets as they can through different sub-agents. And so it's kind of like a random grab bag. And for some reason, I got a Japanese publisher and the book just took off there. And I kept getting like Japanese press clippings telling me that I had won awards, but all I could see was just like my name and like a #1 or something like that. And then it turned out that there were these 3 prestigious awards, and I was the only person to ever win all 3. So then that took it to like another level. And then I was told that they wanted to make a movie out of my book, but it was going to be a Japanese movie in Japanese with Japanese people playing all the parts. My book takes place in Queens, right? So with a guy somewhat like me, you know, playing the main part. So it was incredibly surreal. And, you know, really one of the greatest experiences of my life. I mean, I went over there. I sometimes compare it to kind of having like a secret crush on somebody who it turns out likes you too, because although the book has nothing to do with Japan whatsoever, I am a big fan of Japanese films, of Japanese fiction, you know, so it really was amazing to just be like embraced by this culture. And yeah, I mean, all my work is translated there. Another weird, unforeseen twist is as I said, I'm a big fan of Japanese movies. I'm sure anyone who is knows the filmmaker Kurosawa. And in particular, his great movie Yojimbo, which to me, I mean, I own it on DVD and it's always translated as The Bodyguard. But when The Bouncer got sold to Japan, I was asked in an interview why I named my novel Yojimbo. It turns out that's actually also the word they use to translate bouncer. So I never would have had, you know, the gall or whatever, the nerve to take that title. But once again, I was somehow in sync with Japan.
Well, better than my struggle.
Yeah.
And actually, so speaking of from Japanese movies is there any US adaptation maybe brewing, or just even your fantasy of one? And I'm curious, you think of actors or casting whenever you write.
You know, I really don't, because I do my best to try to think of, I mean, ideally, I want this character to become a real person in my head that I can think about the same way you think about like a friend or something, right? Like, because then I feel like I can get close as possible to making them like a real person in the character's mind. So I try not to sort of picture a movie star or a character from another book. That said, the books are optioned. I don't know if I'm supposed to say who buys, so I won't, but some very cool people who made some very cool Netflix shows. These things take a long time and have many ups and downs, as I'm sure some of you know. And then, of course, we had a pandemic right in the middle of it all. So I really don't have any idea what's going on. I will say that they recently renewed the option, which, you know, it's not a huge amount. I'm not a writer at that level, but it does mean that I guess they're serious about doing it. They were willing to like cough up some money. So fingers crossed, you know, there are people out there trying to make a Joe the Bouncer TV show, but I really don't know when that's going to happen.
Well, we'll all cross our fingers and knock on wood and everything else. Yeah. Is there? It's funny when you said, you know, Japanese. That you're a big fan of Japanese film and literature. I was actually just fielding this question earlier today that there seems to be more Japanese crime fiction, if not being written, being translated. I'm curious if you've read any of it. I mean, have you read?
I don't know much of the recent stuff. No, I don't. I mean, my favorite Japanese writers tend to be, you know, people like Yoko Tawada, people, you know, like classic writers. You know, I mean, I really Murakami. You know, all of the great Japanese writers from the earlier part of the 20th century. I mean, I have to say, in general, I often am weaker on really new things. It's an embarrassing thing, since in theory that's my like business. But between teaching and doing the reading that I associate with my own books, I'm sort of often either far behind the curve or off in my own little side roads, you know? So I'm ashamed to say, often when people talk about some really cool new book that's just come out, I actually have no idea about it.
Well, we still have time for a few more questions, but I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that David came in last week to sign our copies. So if you haven't already bought one, please come to the bookstore, Mysterious Bookshop, or also I will now post a link in the chat. So we do have the book. It is officially out today, but David came in a little early, so please get your copy from the bookstore if you're so inclined. And then when we're just waiting, hopefully we'll get a couple more audience questions. I've got more of my own, but I have one selfish one, since you are such a fountain of wisdom with literature, and you made me think of him when you were talking about strip clubs in San Francisco. Have you ever read William Holman?
Oh, yeah, you know, I haven't much. He's a really intriguing figure. And I actually have read some of his nonfiction. Yeah, you know,
well, I haven't read him either. That wasn't a gotcha question where I'm an expert. I just
no. To be honest, his books are really, really long.
Yes, exactly.
and even though I'm not in theory opposed to long books, because I'm an obsessive Proust reader, again, between like, you know, being on like a teaching schedule, it's sort of like, when am I going to get around to reading this book? So yeah, he is a really intriguing person though. And I've even known some people who met him and interviewed him, and I think he's quite the character, but no, I don't know his work.
Okay. Yeah, I've been meaning to read The Royal Family for, you know, over 5 years. I keep moving with it, and it's about this big, but yes, I know it's San Francisco prostitution and a private eye, sort of one of those big crime novels that you would never find in a mystery section bookstore. Yeah. Well, again, we do have time for someone to chime in with a final question, but otherwise we'll be wrapping up in a little bit. But it's always interesting to me to hear, what are you reading now, regardless of genre? Maybe how we end. It's I always
let's see. Okay, hold on. I will literally. So I am going back and forth between rereading some Nero Wolfe books. And I am reading this, which is a book about the painter Philip Guston, and I just finished this big biography of the painter Lucian Freud. And you know what? She's doing an event tonight, so I'll also put in a quick. I haven't got a chance to start it yet, but my friend Sarah Davis wrote a book, which I think is a bit of a kind of offbeat mystery. And she was kind enough to send me a copy. So I'm going to read this.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Are you a painter, or is that just an interest?
No, and I'm a painter in my imagination. I always, in my mind, I sometimes used to think, oh, as soon as I get this writing thing down, I'll start painting on the side. And, decades went by and I'm still trying to get the writing thing down. But I've always been fascinated with painters. And I think in a way it's something that I can just be like a fan of. I've never even taken an art history class. But I also find lately that I almost like reading about painters more than I get very tired reading about writers all the time and book reviews and things that are coming out. And I think in a way, reading about art is a way for me to keep thinking about the creative process, but not thinking about myself and the business that I'm in and so forth. So yeah, it's become a kind of side obsession. There is a painter character in the Joe books. His friend Frank is a painter. And I have in the back of my head a very vague idea of a novel I might write someday about a painter. But no, I'm just a fan. It's
funny. All of, or most of them, not all, but most of my books are in storage right now. So I actually just had to Google it because I could just picture the cover and where it should be on my bookshelf if I had all my books. But I a few months ago read this great book called Rogues Gallery, or I kind of leafed through it, and it was, I don't know if this would take some of the joy out of your hobby, because it's all about the business of art and about art collectors and dealers. And but yeah, it's just fascinating. I don't know, one of those worlds that, unless you're directly embroiled in it, is something I never gave much thought. But I found myself surprisingly completely transfixed, even when half the time I didn't know who the painters were. I would just have to Google them to have any idea who they were talking about. But yeah, it's a fascinating world.
Well, this Lucian Freud biography was fantastic because a lot of it is actually based on many, many taped telephone conversations that he had with the author, William Fever. I believe that's how he says his name. And so it's actually full of just anecdotes about like the Cray brothers and Francis Bacon and
the gangsters, the Cray brothers.
Yeah, like that whole world of living a post-war London. It's really like he was living in one of the most kind of crime-ridden spots in London, in buildings that were being condemned after the war, so he could live in them for free, and was like a terrible gambler. So he's sort of all mixed up with all these characters and, bank robbers. And they're certainly, they're not crime novels to any degree, but if you're fascinated with that, with the London kind of like, 50s, 60s underworld, which I am, it's almost as good for reading that as it is for reading about a painter.
Oh, excellent. Well, from the CIA smuggling heroin to painters in the London underworld, we covered quite the spectrum. If you have any final words, again, on your behalf, but you can plug it yourself. Again, out today, please buy it. We wouldn't mind if you bought it from the Mysterious Bookshop, of course. And, any final thoughts?
Just, I want to say thank you to everyone who showed up tonight, and to you and to everyone at Mysterious Press for, it was a weird time to be like putting a book out. I think originally this was going to come out a few months ago and we pushed it back. And I don't know, it's just, there's much bigger things going on in the world than my little book, but it's just, to me, it's just like a very hopeful, happy thing that makes me feel like, we're coming out of hibernation and doing things, and I'm just very grateful. So that's it.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate you being here, and we're thrilled to be celebrating the book. So, again, Against the Law, and thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And, if you joined us late, this will be available wherever you're watching it, the YouTube or the Facebook. I don't know if it's immediately after this ends, but you could always catch the full conversation there. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night. Thank you.